Madison Sinclair checked her Cartier watch for the third time in 2 minutes, her manicured fingers drumming against the marble countertop of Café Luna, one of downtown Seattle's most exclusive establishments. The 26-year-old marketing executive for her father's tech company had never been stood up before, and the unfamiliar sting of rejection mixed with her usual impatience. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, and her designer blazer screamed success and privilege. "Another sparkling water, Miss Sinclair?" asked the server, recognizing her from previous visits with her father's business associates. "No, thank you, Marcus. I'm sure he'll be here any moment," Madison replied, forcing a smile while internally fuming. Her blind date, arranged by her sorority sister Chelsea, was already 20 minutes late. The restaurant buzzed with Seattle's elite, tech executives, venture capitalists, and old money families who'd built their fortunes in timber and shipping decades ago. Madison's phone buzzed. A text from her best friend, Paige. "How's the date? With Mr. Perfect going? Chelsea said he's a total catch." She typed back quickly. "He's late. Probably stuck in traffic like all these common people who can't afford to live downtown." The irony wasn't lost on her, that she'd just complained about traffic while waiting for someone she'd never met. Madison had grown up in Bellevue's most exclusive neighborhood, where her father's company had pioneered several breakthrough software applications. She'd attended private schools, summered in the Hamptons, and genuinely believed that success was simply a matter of working hard and making smart choices, something she assumed everyone could do if they really tried. Her father, Richard Sinclair, had built Sinclair Technologies from the ground up, and Madison had inherited both his business acumen and his unwavering belief that America was a true meritocracy. "If people just applied themselves, they wouldn't need handouts," was a phrase she'd heard countless times at family dinners, usually when discussing her father's opposition to various social programs. Outside, she watched a sleek black sedan pull up to the curb. Finally, she thought, smoothing her blazer and preparing to meet this mysterious man Chelsea had described as ambitious, handsome, and from a good family. Madison had specific requirements for the men she dated. They needed to fit seamlessly into her world of charity galas, corporate events, and weekend trips to their family's vacation homes. A tall, well-dressed black man stepped out of the car, looking around uncertainly. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and dark jeans, his athletic build evident even from a distance. Madison frowned slightly, assuming he must be someone's driver or perhaps meeting a friend. It never occurred to her that this might be her date. The man walked toward the restaurant, checking his phone, and Madison felt a flutter of annoyance. Where was her actual date? She'd specifically requested someone who would complement her lifestyle, someone who understood the importance of networking, social positioning, and maintaining the right image. Her friends at the country club would expect to hear details about this mysterious suitor, and she needed someone who would impress them. As the black man approached her table, Madison looked past him, still scanning for her real date. When he stopped directly in front of her, she looked up with barely concealed irritation. "Excuse me, are you Madison?" he asked, his voice deep and warm with a slight southern accent that seemed out of place in this polished setting. "Hello, the shade of love family. So happy you're here. Before we jump into the next part of the story, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your country and state in the comments. Also, how's the story been so far? We love reading your thoughts. Yes, every single comment. And it really keeps us motivated. Let's aim for 50 comments on this video. Think we can hit it? Your support means the world, so don't forget to comment, share, and keep the energy flowing. Madison stared at the man standing before her, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed equally impossible. This couldn't be her blind date. Chelsea would never set her up with someone so different. Her internal voice whispered the thoughts she'd never say aloud, thoughts that had been carefully cultivated through years of subtle messaging from her social circle. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," Madison said, her voice carrying the polite dismissiveness she'd perfected during years of charity work. "I'm waiting for someone else." The man looked confused, checking his phone again. "Are you Madison Sinclair? I'm Marcus. Well, Marcus Thompson. I think there might be some confusion here too." Marcus, the same name as the server, Madison noted, though she didn't make the connection to why that might seem coincidental. Instead, her mind was already constructing explanations that fit her worldview. Perhaps this Marcus was lost, or maybe he was, delivering something for her actual date. She'd grown up hearing her father's friends discuss those people in coded language at dinner parties, how they lacked initiative, how affirmative action had given them unfair advantages, how crime in certain neighborhoods was just a cultural problem that couldn't be fixed by throwing money at it. "I don't think we have an appointment," Madison said carefully, the way she'd been taught to speak to service workers. Polite but firm, maintaining appropriate boundaries. Her sorority sisters had always praised her for being so good with the help, never realizing the condescension embedded in the compliment. Her phone rang, interrupting the awkward moment. "Madison, honey," Chelsea's voice bubbled through the speaker. "How's the date going? I'm so excited to hear about Marcus." Madison's stomach dropped. "Chelsea, there's been some kind of mistake. The person here isn't—" "Oh no, did he not show up? Marcus seemed so reliable when I met him at that networking event. Tall, handsome, really articulate. He mentioned he was in transportation logistics." Transportation logistics. Madison's eyes fell on the black sedan outside, then back to Marcus, who was clearly listening to her conversation. The pieces clicked together in the most horrifying way possible. This was her blind date. This was the man Chelsea thought would be perfect for her. After ending the call with promises to call back later, Madison found herself in an impossible situation. Her entire social identity was built on maintaining appearances, on being seen with the right people at the right places. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Darling, you must always remember that perception is reality. The people you associate with reflect directly on your character and your family's reputation." She'd been raised to believe that her success was earned through merit, that her private school education and Ivy League connections were simply rewards for hard work. The idea that others might not have had the same opportunities wasn't something she'd seriously considered. In her world, people succeeded or failed based on their choices and work ethic. If someone was driving an Uber instead of running a company, it was because they lacked ambition or hadn't made smart decisions. Looking at Marcus now, Madison felt a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. He was undeniably attractive, well-dressed, and seemed intelligent. But what would her parents say? What would her friends think? Her father's business partners already whispered about companies that prioritize diversity over qualifications. Her mother's book club had spent entire afternoons discussing how political correctness was ruining traditional values. "Look, Madison," Marcus said gently, seeming to sense her internal conflict. "I can see this isn't what you expected. Chelsea didn't really tell me much about you either, except that you were successful and looking for someone genuine. Maybe we both got more than we bargained for." His words stung because they implied he might be equally disappointed in her, a possibility that had never occurred to Madison. In her experience, men were always trying to impress her, to prove they were worthy of her attention. The idea that she might not meet his standards was both foreign and oddly unsettling. The next morning, Madison walked into the gleaming lobby of Sinclair Technologies, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors with practiced confidence. The events of the previous evening replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't stop watching. After the initial shock, she'd managed to maintain her composure, suggesting they grab coffee as friends, while internally calculating how to spin this story to her social circle. "Good morning, Miss Sinclair," called Jennifer, the young Asian-American receptionist who'd started 6 months ago, fresh from community college. Madison offered her standard professional smile, warm enough to seem approachable, distant enough to maintain hierarchy. "Morning, Jennifer. Is my father in yet? He's in the conference room with the Johnson account team. Should I let him know?" "You're here?" Madison waved her off dismissively. "No need. I'll catch up with him later." She'd learned early that maintaining authority meant never seeming too eager or dependent, even on family members. The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave her time to rehearse her story about the disastrous blind date she'd already crafted, the perfect narrative, focusing on the mix-up, the awkwardness, the cultural differences that made any real connection impossible. Her friends would laugh sympathetically and probably share their own dating horror stories. "Madison, there you are!" Paige Williams, her college roommate and current marketing coordinator, practically bounced over to her office. Paige came from old Seattle money. Her family had made their fortune in shipping during the gold rush, and she understood the unspoken rules of their social hierarchy better than anyone. "So, tell me everything about last night. Chelsea's been texting me all morning wanting details." Madison closed her office door and settled into her ergonomic chair, surrounded by awards, family photos, and carefully curated art pieces that projected success and sophistication. "It was educational," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Educational how? Was he boring? Cheap? Please tell me he didn't take you somewhere embarrassing." "Actually, he was..." Madison paused, surprised to find herself searching for the right word. "He wasn't what I expected, at all." She told Paige about the confusion, the realization that Marcus was their driver rather than a fellow professional, the awkward coffee conversation where she'd discovered he was actually quite intelligent and well-spoken. But even as she recounted the facts, Madison found herself editing the story, emphasizing the differences between their worlds while downplaying her own growing curiosity about his perspective. "Oh my God, Madison, that's terrible," Paige gasped, dramatically. "Chelsea had no idea? How could she not mention something so important? I mean, what would people think if you'd actually been seen together seriously?" "Exactly," Madison agreed, though something about Paige's reaction made her uncomfortable. "I mean, he seems like a nice enough person, but we're from completely different worlds. He wouldn't understand our lifestyle, our responsibilities, the pressure we're under." As she spoke, Madison realized she was repeating phrases she'd heard her entire life, coded language that allowed her social circle to maintain their prejudices while avoiding direct confrontation with their own biases. They weren't racist, they told themselves. They simply understood that cultural differences created natural boundaries, that people were more comfortable with their own kind, that trying to force connections across these lines was unfair to everyone involved. Later that afternoon, Madison found herself at the Rainier Club, Seattle's most exclusive private establishment, meeting her mother Catherine for their weekly lunch. The dining room hummed with quiet conversations among the city's power brokers, tech executives, real estate developers, political figures, and old money families who'd shaped Seattle's growth for generations. "Darling, you look tired," Catherine observed, her keen eyes missing nothing as always. "Is work stressing you? Your father mentioned the Morrison project has been challenging." "Work's fine, Mother. Just had an interesting evening yesterday." Madison found herself telling a carefully sanitized version of the story, focusing on Chelsea's poor judgment and the awkwardness of the situation. Catherine listened with the kind of attention she usually reserved for particularly juicy gossip. "Well, I suppose it's good to see how the other half lives occasionally. Builds character, gives you perspective on how fortunate we are." She paused delicately. "Though I do hope you're being more selective about the people Chelsea introduces you to. Your associations matter more than ever now that you're taking on more responsibility at the company." The conversation drifted to safer topics: the upcoming charity gala, vacation plans for Martha's Vineyard, the latest developments in their social circle. But Madison found her attention wandering, remembering Marcus's genuine laugh when she'd made a nervous joke about Seattle coffee culture, the way he'd listened intently when she talked about her work, the quiet dignity with which he'd handled her obvious discomfort. She pushed these thoughts aside, reminding herself of the practical realities. Her life was carefully constructed around certain expectations and standards. Deviating from them wouldn't just affect her, it would impact her family's reputation, her career prospects, and her place in the social network that had defined her identity since childhood. 3 days later, Madison's perfectly ordered world collided with reality in the most unexpected way possible. She was leaving Pike Place Market after a client lunch, her arms full of artisanal purchases that would look perfect in her Queen Anne condo, when her phone died just as she tried to call her regular car service. The irony of standing in the heart of Seattle's most touristy area, surrounded by the kind of diverse crowd she usually avoided, wasn't lost on her. With no other choice, she reluctantly opened the Uber app on her backup phone, something she downloaded months ago but never actually used. The idea of riding with strangers had always seemed unnecessary when her father's company provided car service for executives. But here she was, watching a familiar black sedan pull up to the curb. The driver's window rolled down, and Marcus Thompson's surprised face appeared. "Madison, what are the odds?" For a moment, Madison considered canceling the ride and calling a taxi instead, but curious tourists and locals were staring at the obviously uncomfortable interaction, and her ingrained need to maintain appearances kicked in. "Small world," she managed, sliding into the back seat with as much dignity as she could muster. "Where to?" Marcus asked professionally, though she caught him glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Queen Anne, the Meridian Building," she rattled off her address, then immediately regretted providing so much personal information. Her mother's warnings about safety and discretion echoed in her mind. The drive started in awkward silence, Seattle's late afternoon traffic giving them plenty of time to marinate in the uncomfortable situation. Madison stared out the window, watching the city pass by, homeless encampments under overpasses, construction workers grabbing coffee from food trucks, street musicians performing for tourists. She rarely saw Seattle from this angle, usually traveling in the elevated corridors between exclusive establishments. "So," Marcus finally said, his voice cutting through her observations, "how's the dating scene going? Any more surprise setups?" Despite herself, Madison almost smiled. "Chelsea's been banned from matchmaking duties. I think she learned her lesson." "Ouch. That bad, huh?" There was amusement in his voice, but also something else. Perhaps disappointment she didn't expect. "It's not personal," Madison found herself explaining, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to justify herself. "It's just that we're from different worlds, different expectations, different goals, different—" She trailed off, realizing how her words might sound. "Different colors?" Marcus asked quietly, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. The directness of his question caught Madison completely off guard. In her social circle, these things were never discussed so bluntly. Race was acknowledged through careful euphemisms, coded language, and polite deflections that allowed everyone to maintain plausible deniability about their true feelings. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly, though they both knew it was at least part of what she meant. "I know exactly what you meant, Madison. I've heard variations of that speech my whole life." Marcus's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. "Different worlds, different backgrounds, different cultures. It's a nice way to avoid saying what you really think." They were stopped at a red light in the heart of Capitol Hill, surrounded by the kind of diverse, vibrant community that Madison rarely experienced firsthand. She watched a group of college students, white, black, Asian, Latino, laughing together as they waited to cross the street, completely comfortable in each other's company in a way that seemed foreign to her carefully segregated social experience. "You don't know anything about my world," Madison said defensively, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "You're right, I don't. But I know what it's like to be judged before someone gets to know me. I know what it's like to be qualified for something but dismissed because I don't fit someone's image of who belongs in certain spaces." Marcus pulled into traffic as the light changed. "I also know that most people who talk about different worlds have never actually taken the time to see how similar those worlds really are." His words hit Madison in an unexpected way. She thought about her automatic assumptions 3 days ago, her immediate certainty that he couldn't possibly be her date, her relief when she could categorize him as just the driver. She'd never questioned these reactions before. They'd seemed natural, obvious, the result of legitimate practical considerations. But sitting in his car now, listening to his articulate observations about her behavior, Madison felt something crack in her carefully constructed worldview. Not break completely, that would take much more than one uncomfortable conversation, but crack enough to let in a sliver of doubt about assumptions she'd never examined. "I'm not prejudiced," she said finally, though the words sounded weak even to her own ears. Marcus was quiet for a long moment as they navigated the narrow streets leading to her neighborhood. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than she expected. "Madison, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're a person who's never had to examine certain beliefs because they've never been challenged in your daily life. There's a difference." They pulled up in front of her building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that housed some of Seattle's wealthiest young professionals. The contrast between her world and the diverse neighborhood they'd just driven through couldn't have been more stark. Madison sat in the back seat for a moment longer than necessary, processing their conversation. "Thank you for the ride," she said formally, reaching for her purse to tip him through the app. "Madison," Marcus said as she opened the door, "if you ever want to see what my world actually looks like, instead of just assuming you know, let me know. You might be surprised." As she walked into her building's marble lobby, Madison found herself wondering for the first time what assumptions Marcus might have made about her world, and whether they might be just as wrong as hers had been about his. Madison spent the weekend pacing around her pristine condo, unable to shake the memory of Marcus's challenge. The conversation played on repeat in her mind, especially his final words about seeing his world instead of assuming she knew what it looked like. She'd tried to dismiss his comments as defensive overreaction, but something about his calm certainty had unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully explain. Sunday evening found her on the phone with her sister Emma, who was finishing her residency at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Emma had always been the more socially conscious of the Sinclair daughters, though she'd never directly challenged the family's worldview. "So let me get this straight," Emma said, after Madison finished recounting the week's events. "You went on a blind date with a black guy, assumed he was the driver, had coffee with him anyway, and now you're obsessing over something he said during an Uber ride?" "I'm not obsessing," Madison protested, though she realized she'd brought up the topic 3 times during their conversation. "I just found his perspective interesting." "Interesting how?" Madison stared out her floor-to-ceiling windows at the Seattle skyline, lights twinkling in the gathering darkness. "He said I'd never had to examine certain beliefs because they'd never been challenged. That made me wonder what beliefs he was talking about." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Maddie, can I ask you something honestly? When was the last time you had a real conversation with someone who didn't look like us or come from our background?" The question hit Madison like a physical blow because the answer was so obvious. "That's different, Em. It's not like I avoid people." "I'm not saying you avoid people. I'm saying your life is structured so you rarely encounter anyone outside our social circle in meaningful ways. Think about it. Your job, your friends, your neighborhood, your activities. When do you actually interact with people who might challenge your assumptions about the world?" Madison wanted to argue, but examples wouldn't come. Jennifer at the office was the closest thing to diversity in her daily life, and even those interactions were carefully bounded by professional hierarchy. The servers at her regular restaurants, the staff at her gym, the people who cleaned her building, she was polite to all of them, but she'd never thought of them as individuals with their own perspectives and experiences worth considering. "I was raised to be respectful to everyone," she said finally. "Respectful, yes, but have you ever been curious about their lives, their stories, their opinions on things that matter?" Emma's voice was gentle but probing. "There's a difference between being polite and actually seeing people as fully human." After they hung up, Madison found herself thinking about Marcus's offer to show her his world. What would that even mean? Where did he live? What did he do when he wasn't driving? For Uber? Who were his friends, his family? She realized she'd never asked him any personal questions during their brief interactions, had never shown the kind of basic interest in his life that she expected men to show in hers. Monday morning brought a surprise that shattered her usual routine. Jennifer wasn't at the reception desk when Madison arrived at work. Instead, a temp worker explained that Jennifer had been in a car accident over the weekend and would be out for several weeks recovering from her injuries. "Is she okay? Was anyone else hurt?" Madison found herself asking, genuinely concerned in a way that surprised her. "Her little boy was in the car, but he's fine. Jennifer's got some broken ribs and a concussion, though. She'll be okay, but it's Going to be tough financially with the medical bills and missing work. For the first time, Madison realized she knew nothing about Jennifer's personal life beyond her professional qualifications. She had a son. She worried about medical bills. She was dealing with the same kind of unexpected crisis that could happen to anyone, but without the financial safety net that Madison had always taken for granted. That afternoon, Madison did something she'd never done before. She looked up Jennifer's personnel file and found her home address, then arranged for a flower delivery with a note expressing concern and offering help if needed. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The following evening, Madison found herself in an even more unexpected situation. She'd attended a charity gala for the Seattle Children's Hospital, the kind of exclusive event where her presence was expected and her family's donation would be publicly acknowledged. But as she stood in the museum's grand hall, surrounded by familiar faces discussing familiar topics, she felt oddly disconnected from the scene. "Madison, darling," her mother's friend Patricia Wellington swept over, resplendent in diamonds and designer gowns. "How lovely you look tonight. I was just telling your mother how proud she must be of your success at Sinclair Technologies." "Thank you, Mrs. Wellington," Madison replied automatically, her attention drifting to the catering staff moving efficiently through the crowd. She noticed a young black woman about her own age carefully arranging appetizers on a serving tray, her movements precise and professional despite the obvious fatigue in her eyes. "Of course, success like yours is so rare these days," Patricia continued, oblivious to Madison's distraction. "So many young people expect everything handed to them, instead of working for it. It's refreshing to see someone from a good family who understands the value of hard work and personal responsibility." Madison nodded politely, but something about Patricia's words made her uncomfortable. The server she'd been watching approached, their group, offering appetizers with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Madison found herself wondering what this woman's story was, what her goals were, what obstacles she might be facing that had nothing to do with work ethic or personal responsibility. "Thank you," Madison said as she took an appetizer, making eye contact with the server in a way she'd never done before. For just a moment, she saw recognition pass between them, one human being acknowledging another before the server moved on to the next group. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of familiar conversations and predictable interactions. Madison played her role perfectly, smiled at the right moments, laughed at the appropriate jokes, and made small talk about topics that had once seemed important but now felt increasingly hollow. But underneath her polished exterior, she found herself thinking about Marcus's challenge, Emma's questions, and the growing realization that her carefully constructed world might be far smaller and more limited than she'd ever realized. "Hello, the Shade of Love family. So happy you're here. Before we jump into the next part of the story, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your country and state in the comments. Also, how's the story been so far? We love reading your thoughts. Yes, every single comment. And it really keeps us motivated. Let's aim for 50 comments on this video. Think we can hit it? Your support means the world, so don't forget to comment, share, and keep the energy flowing. Madison's world shifted completely the following Thursday afternoon when she witnessed something that shattered every assumption she'd made about Marcus Thompson. She'd left work early for a dentist appointment in Belltown and was walking to her car when she heard shouting from the alley beside the medical building. "Please, sir, I just need a few more days. My daughter's been in the hospital and I haven't been able to work my full shifts." Madison paused, recognizing the voice of Elena Rodriguez, the woman who cleaned the office buildings in her neighborhood. Elena was pleading with a large, aggressive-looking man who appeared to be some kind of debt collector or landlord. "I don't care about your sob stories, lady. You're 3 weeks behind on rent. You got until tomorrow to come up with $800 or you're out." "But where will we go? My daughter just got out of the hospital." "Not my problem. Should have thought about that before you decided to have kids you can't afford." Madison stood frozen, her instincts warring between the urge to help and her ingrained habit of avoiding messy situations that didn't directly concern her. She'd always donated to charities, of course, but actually intervening in someone's personal crisis felt foreign and potentially problematic. Then she saw a familiar black sedan pull into the alley. Marcus stepped out of his car, and Madison watched, in fascination as he approached the confrontation with calm confidence. She ducked behind a parked car, close enough to hear but hidden from view. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely to the aggressive man. "Is there a problem here?" "Mind your own business, buddy. This is between me and the tenant." "Well, I couldn't help but notice you're raising your voice at this lady and she seems upset. Just wanted to make sure everything's okay." Marcus's tone remained friendly but firm, and Madison noticed how his presence immediately changed the dynamic of the situation. "Look, this woman owes me money, all right? I'm just trying to collect what's owed." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I understand business is business. Elena, right?" He addressed the woman directly. "Are you okay? You seem pretty shaken up." Elena looked surprised that this stranger knew her name and was treating her with such respect. Yes, I'm okay. I just need more time to get the rent money together. My daughter Isabella was in the hospital with pneumonia and I couldn't work." "Full hours? That must have been terrifying for you," Marcus said with genuine concern. "Is she better now?" "Yes, thank God. But the medical bills and missing work?" Elena's voice cracked with exhaustion and stress. Madison watched Marcus pull out his phone and make a quick call. "Hey, Mrs. Patterson. It's Marcus. I know it's short notice, but do you still need help with that catering job this weekend? I might have someone perfect for it." "Great. I'll have her call you." He turned back to Elena. "I just got you a weekend catering gig that pays $200. It's not everything, but it'll help. And Elena, take my number. If you need transportation to get to work while you're catching up, call me. First few rides are free." The debt collector seemed taken aback by Marcus's intervention. "Look, that's real nice and all, but she still owes—" "How much exactly?" Marcus asked, pulling out his wallet. $800. Without hesitation, Marcus counted out bills. "Tell you what, here's $400. Elena can get you the other $400 by next week with her new work. That seem fair to everyone?" Madison's hands flew to her mouth in shock. She watched Marcus, who she'd assumed was just an Uber driver struggling to make ends meet, casually hand over $400 to help a complete stranger. This wasn't the impulsive gesture of someone with money to burn. This was the deliberate action of someone who understood struggle and chose to help anyway. The debt collector took the money, grumbled something about Marcus being a bleeding heart, and left. Elena broke down crying, trying to thank Marcus while he gently insisted it wasn't necessary. "We all need help sometimes," he said simply. "The only difference between people who get help and people who don't is whether someone shows up when they need it." Madison watched Elena give Marcus a fierce hug before hurrying back to her work, and she saw the quiet satisfaction on his face. Not pride or self-congratulation, just the simple contentment of someone who'd done the right thing because it needed doing. As Marcus returned to his car, Madison found herself stepping out from behind her hiding spot without conscious thought. "Marcus?" He looked surprised to see her. "Madison, what are you doing here?" I saw what you just did." She struggled to find words for what she'd witnessed. "That was incredible." Marcus looked uncomfortable with her praise. "It wasn't incredible. It was basic human decency. Elena's a good person going through a rough patch. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," Madison said quietly, thinking of her own paralysis during the confrontation. "Anyone wouldn't have done the same thing. Most people would have walked away. Maybe. People in your world would have walked away," Marcus said, not unkindly. "But where I come from, we look out for each other because we know how quickly things can go wrong. We know that the difference between making it and not making it sometimes comes down to whether someone gives you a chance when you need it most." Madison thought about the $400 he'd just given away, money that probably represented significant sacrifice for him. She thought about the catering job he'd arranged, the free rides he'd offered, the way he'd treated Elena with dignity and respect while she was at her most vulnerable. "How did you know her name?" she asked. "Elena cleans my apartment building. We chat sometimes when I'm coming home from late shifts. She's been worried sick about her daughter." Marcus studied Madison's face. "You look surprised that I actually know the people who work in my neighborhood." "I am surprised," Madison admitted. I'm ashamed to say I don't even know the names of most of the people who work in my building. For the first time since she'd known him, Marcus smiled at her with something approaching warmth. Well, that's something you could change if you wanted, too. As he drove away, Madison stood in the alley thinking about Elena's tears of gratitude, Marcus's casual generosity, and her own previous assumptions about who deserved help and why. Everything she thought she knew about character, success, and human worth suddenly seemed far more complicated than she'd ever imagined. The following weekend, Madison found herself at her parents' estate in Bellevue for their monthly family dinner, a tradition that had felt comforting and familiar her entire life, but now seemed fraught with invisible tensions she'd never noticed before. The sprawling house overlooked Lake Washington, its perfectly manicured grounds maintained by a crew of landscapers Madison had never bothered to learn about. "Darling, you seem distracted tonight," her mother Catherine observed as they sat in the formal dining room, surrounded by family portraits and antique furniture that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth and social position. "Is everything all right at work?" Madison pushed her salmon around her plate, thinking about Elena Rodriguez and wondering if her family's housekeeper, Maria, had her own struggles they'd never asked about. "Work's fine. I've just been thinking about some things lately." Her father Richard looked up from his wine. "Oh, what kind of things?" "If it's the Morrison account, I told you that client was going to be difficult. Some people just don't understand quality when they see it." "Actually, Dad, I've been thinking about inequality, about how different people's experiences are in this city." The statement landed in the dining room like a small bomb. Madison's parents exchanged glances, and her older brother David, who worked in their father's investment division, raised his eyebrows. "Inequality?" David repeated. "Madison, you sound like one of those bleeding heart politicians. What brought this on?" Madison thought carefully about her words, knowing that mentioning Marcus specifically would only distract from the real issues she was beginning to understand. "I've just been noticing things more lately, like how hard some people work for very little money, while others seem to have opportunities handed to them." "Sweetheart," Catherine said in the tone she'd used to correct Madison's thinking since childhood. "Everyone has opportunities in America. That's what makes this country great. Some people just make better choices than others. But what if the choices aren't really equal?" Madison pressed, remembering Marcus's $400 and thinking about Elena's medical bills. "What if some people start with advantages that make it easier to make good choices?" Richard set down his wine glass with the kind of deliberate movement that signaled his growing impatience. "Madison, I built this company from nothing. Your grandfather came to this country with empty pockets and made something of himself through hard work and determination. Nobody handed us anything." "I know that, Dad, but nothing," Richard interrupted, his voice carrying the authority that had built Sinclair Technologies into a Fortune 500 company. "This kind of thinking is dangerous, Madison. It leads to excuses, to dependency, to the breakdown of the values that built America. When you start believing that success is just luck or privilege, you undermine everything that makes our society work." David nodded vigorously. "Exactly. And frankly, Madison, this sounds like the kind of liberal guilt they're pushing in universities these days. You didn't go to Berkeley, you went to Stanford. They should have taught you better than this." Madison felt the familiar pressure of family expectations weighing down on her, the subtle but unmistakable message that questioning their worldview wasn't just wrong, it was a betrayal of everything they'd worked to build. She'd felt this pressure before, but had never recognized it as such, had always assumed it was simply the natural order of things. "I'm not trying to undermine anything," she said quietly. "I just think maybe the world is more complicated than we've always assumed." Catherine reached across the table to pat Madison's hand in the condescending way that had always made her feel both loved and diminished. "Darling, you have such a good heart. That's why we need to be careful about the influences in your life. Sometimes being too sympathetic can cloud your judgment about what really helps people." "What do you mean?" "Well, take your little charity work, for instance. We've always supported your volunteer efforts because giving back is important, but there's a difference between helping people improve their lives and enabling dependency. The best thing we can do for less fortunate people is to show them that success is possible through hard work, not handouts." Madison thought about Marcus giving Elena $400 without hesitation, about him arranging work for her, about the dignity with which he'd treated someone most people would have dismissed. Had that been enabling dependency, or had it been exactly the kind of help that allowed someone to get back on their feet? "I saw someone help a woman the other day," Madison said carefully. "She was behind on rent because her daughter had been hospitalized and she couldn't work full hours. Someone gave her money to catch up and found her additional work. Was that enabling dependency?" "That depends," Richard said, leaning back in his chair with the expression he wore when explaining complex business concepts to less experienced employees. "Was it a one-time hand-up to help someone get back on track? Or was it part of a pattern of rescuing people from the consequences of their poor decisions?" It seemed like a one-time thing. The person helping seemed to know that sometimes people just need someone to show up when they're in trouble. "And who was this Good Samaritan?" Catherine asked with barely concealed suspicion. "Someone from your social circle?" Madison hesitated, knowing that revealing Marcus's identity would immediately change the nature of the conversation. Her family would focus on his race, his job, his background, anything but the actual content of his character or the wisdom of his actions. "Just someone I met recently," she said finally. "But it made me think about how we usually handle these situations, how we decide who deserves help and who doesn't." The conversation continued for another hour, with her family systematically dismantling every point Madison tried to make. They weren't cruel about it. Their arguments were sophisticated, well-reasoned, and delivered with the kind of intellectual authority that had always impressed her. But Madison began to notice something she'd never seen before: how their reasoning always led to the same conclusion, regardless of the specific circumstances. Individual responsibility was always the answer. Systemic problems were always blamed on personal failures. And the existing social order was always justified as the natural result of merit and hard work. After dinner, as Madison prepared to leave, her mother walked her to the door with the kind of concerned expression usually reserved for serious health scares. "Madison, honey, I want you to be careful about the people you're spending time with lately. You seem different, more agitated, I suppose, less settled in yourself. Maybe being unsettled isn't always a bad thing, Mom." Catherine's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "For our family, it is. Your father and I have worked too hard to build our reputation and our standing in this community to have it undermined by misguided idealism. You have responsibilities, darling, to the family, to the company, to the community that's invested in your success." As Madison drove home through the affluent streets of Bellevue, she felt the weight of those responsibilities pressing down on her like a physical force. But for the first time in her life, she also felt something else, a growing certainty that there might be something more important than maintaining her family's approval and social standing. She just wasn't sure she had the courage to find out what that something might be. 2 weeks later, Madison found herself doing something she'd never done before, deliberately seeking out Marcus Thompson. She'd gotten his number from the Uber app and had been staring at it for 3 days before finally working up the courage to send a text. "This is Madison Sinclair. Would you be willing to meet for coffee? I have some questions I'd like to ask you." His response came back within an hour. "Sure, there's a place called Victrola on Capitol Hill. Saturday at 2 p.m. work for you?" Madison had never been to Capitol Hill by choice. Her mental map of Seattle included downtown, Bellevue, Queen Anne, and a few other upscale neighborhoods, but the area Marcus suggested felt like foreign territory. Diverse, artistic, unpredictable. Everything her social circle had taught her to avoid. Victrola Coffee turned out to be nothing like the sterile corporate chains she frequented. The space buzzed with eclectic energy. Students with laptops, artists sketching, couples deep in conversation, musicians tuning guitars in the corner. The clientele was a rainbow of ethnicities, ages, and styles that would have made her mother clutch her pearls. Marcus was already there when she arrived, reading a paperback book at a corner table. He looked up as she approached, and Madison noticed the careful way he studied her face, as if trying to gauge whether she was genuinely interested in conversation or just satisfying some curiosity. "I wasn't sure you'd actually show up," he said as she sat down. I wasn't sure either, Madison admitted. This isn't exactly my usual kind of place, I figured. That's partly why I chose it. Marcus closed his book. She glimpsed the title as something by Ta-Nehisi Coates and gave her his full attention. So what questions did you want to ask? Madison had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but sitting across from him now, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of the coffee, shop. Her prepared talking points seemed artificial and inadequate. I keep thinking about what you said that day in the Uber, about me never having my beliefs challenged, and then I watched you help Elena, and I realized I don't actually know anything about you. Your life, your background, your story, but I've made assumptions anyway. What kind of assumptions? Madison felt heat rise in her cheeks. Honestly, I assumed you were just an Uber driver because that's all you were qualified to do. I assumed you probably came from a broken family, maybe had some kind of criminal background, definitely hadn't gone to college. I assumed you were bitter about successful people and looking for handouts or sympathy. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. That's a lot of assumptions. I know, and I'm ashamed of them now, but I want to understand where they came from and why they felt so natural to me. Okay, Marcus said slowly. Well, for starters, I have an MBA from the University of Washington. I drive for Uber part-time while I'm building my own logistics consulting business. My parents have been married for 32 years. My dad's a high school principal and my mom's a nurse. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Tacoma, played basketball in high school, made decent grades, never been arrested for anything. Stronger than a speeding ticket. Madison stared at him. But then, why am I driving Uber instead of working for some big company? Marcus finished her question. Because I applied for positions at about 50 firms over the past 2 years. I had great grades, good recommendations, relevant internship experience, but somehow, interviews that went really well over the phone became much less enthusiastic when I showed up in person. The implication hit Madison like a physical blow. You think they discriminated against you? I don't think it, Madison. I know it. Not all of them. Some were honest about their lack of diversity in leadership roles. Some just weren't good cultural fits for other reasons. But enough of them that I finally decided to bet on myself instead of waiting for someone else to give me a chance. Marcus paused to sip his coffee, giving Madison time to process this information. Everything she'd been taught about meritocracy and equal opportunity suddenly seemed naive and incomplete. So you started your own business, she said, finally. I'm trying to. It's harder than I expected, partly because most of my potential clients move in circles I don't have natural access to. The business world is still pretty segregated, even when it's not intentional. People hire people they know. They trust people who remind them of themselves. They feel comfortable with familiar faces in familiar places. Madison thought about her father's business practices, about the golf clubs and private dinners where deals were made, about the informal networks that determined who got opportunities and who didn't. She'd always assumed those networks were based on merit and professional qualifications. It had never occurred to her to wonder who might be excluded from them and why. "What's your business about?" she asked. Marcus's face lit up with enthusiasm. Supply chain optimization for mid-sized companies. A lot of businesses are still using inefficient systems that cost them money and hurt their competitiveness. I can usually save them 15 to 20% on logistics costs within the first year. That sounds impressive. Why haven't you gotten more clients? Because getting in the door requires relationships I don't have yet. Business networking events tend to be pretty homogeneous, and the few diverse ones I've attended are usually focused on social issues rather than actual business development. It's a catch-22. I need clients to build credibility, but I need credibility to get clients. Madison found herself leaning forward, genuinely interested in his challenges for the first time. Have you tried approaching companies directly? Cold calling? Email campaigns? Of course. But decision makers are more likely to take meetings with people who come recommended by mutual contacts. Without those warm introductions, I'm just another unsolicited pitch in their inbox. They talked for another hour, and Madison discovered that Marcus was not only intelligent and ambitious, but also deeply thoughtful about social issues she'd never seriously considered. He spoke about growing up as one of only 3 black students in his advanced placement classes, about being followed by security guards in stores his white friends shopped in without incident, about the exhausting process of constantly proving he belonged in professional spaces that his credentials should have made automatic. "The thing is," Marcus said as their conversation wound down, "I don't tell you this stuff to make you feel guilty or to excuse any failures on my part. I tell you because understanding these realities is the only way to have honest conversations about why our society looks the way it does." "What do you mean?" "I mean that when people like your family look at someone like me and see an Uber driver, they assume it's because of my choices, my work ethic, my qualifications. They don't consider that I might be an Uber driver despite my choices, my work ethic, and my qualifications. And that difference in perspective shapes everything, from policy decisions to individual interactions." As Madison walked back to her car, parked several blocks away in a neighborhood she'd previously considered unsafe, she realized that everything Marcus had shared challenged the fundamental assumptions that had shaped her worldview. If systemic barriers could prevent someone as qualified as Marcus from accessing opportunities, then maybe success wasn't simply a matter of individual merit. And if that was true, then maybe her own success was less about her personal virtues and more about advantages she'd never acknowledged. For the first time in her life, Madison began to wonder whether the world she'd inherited was as fair and meritocratic as she'd always believed, and whether defending that world might mean defending injustices she was only beginning to understand. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later when Madison arrived at work to find Jennifer back at the reception desk, her left arm still in a sling and moving carefully due to her healing ribs. Madison had sent flowers and a card during Jennifer's recovery, but seeing her in person, obviously still in pain and clearly struggling financially, made the abstract concept of inequality suddenly personal and immediate. "Jennifer, how are you? Feeling? Should you even be back at work yet?" "I'm okay, Miss Sinclair. The doctor cleared me for light duty, and I really need to get back to earning." Jennifer's smile was genuine but strained. "Thank you so much for the flowers and the note. That meant a lot." "Of course. Is there anything you need? Any way the company can help?" Jennifer hesitated, clearly debating whether to be honest with her boss's daughter. "Actually, we're still struggling with the medical bills. Insurance covered most of it, but the deductible and the time I missed work. It's been tough. Miguel, that's my son, he's been staying with my mother because I can't afford childcare right now." Madison felt something crack inside her chest. Here was a woman who worked full-time for her family's company, who had been injured in an accident that wasn't her fault, who was separated from her child because of financial pressures that wouldn't even register as inconvenience in Madison's world. "Jennifer, let me talk to HR about emergency assistance programs. We should be able to help with this." "Oh, Miss Sinclair, I already checked. The company doesn't have those kinds of programs. And honestly, I don't want charity. I just need the opportunity to work enough hours to cover my expenses." That afternoon, Madison marched into her father's office with a determination that surprised them both. "Dad, we need to talk about Jennifer Rodriguez and our employee support programs." Richard looked up from his computer with the mildly irritated expression he wore when interrupted. "What about them? Jennifer was in a car accident. She's drowning in medical debt, and she can't afford childcare for her son. We employ her full-time, but she can't make ends meet when an emergency happens. That's not right. Madison, Jennifer's personal financial management isn't the company's responsibility. We pay competitive wages and offer health insurance. What she does with her money is her business." "Competitive wages?" Madison pulled out her phone and showed her father the research she'd done that morning. "Dad, Jennifer makes $32,000 a year. The average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Seattle is $1,800 a month. That's more than half her gross income just for housing. Then she should consider living somewhere more affordable." "Like where?" "If she moves too far out, she can't get to work reliably, and public transportation in this city is limited. She's trapped in a system where she can't afford to live near her job and can't afford to live far from it either." Richard's expression hardened. "Madison, this conversation is inappropriate. We're not a social welfare agency. We're a business. If Jennifer can't manage her expenses on the salary we provide, she's free to find employment elsewhere. And if she can't find better employment elsewhere, if every company pays similar wages while expecting people to live in one of the most expensive cities in America, that's not our problem to solve. Madison stared at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her adult life. This was the man who'd raised her to believe in fairness, merit, and helping those less fortunate. But his version of helping was writing checks to established charities, not addressing the structural problems that made those charities necessary in the first place. What if I told you there was a way to solve this that would actually benefit the company? Richard sighed but gestured for her to continue. Marcus Thompson has a logistics consulting business. He specializes in supply chain optimization and claims he can reduce costs by 15 to 20%. What if we hired him to streamline our operations, used the savings to improve employee benefits, and created a model other companies could follow? Who is Marcus Thompson? Madison took a deep breath. He's the man Chelsea set me up with, the one I mentioned briefly. Richard's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and finally, disapproval. Madison, you cannot be serious. You want me to hire your... What exactly is he to you? He's someone who understands both business and social responsibility. Someone who's actually lived the problems we're talking about instead of just theorizing about them. Absolutely not. Richard's voice carried the finality that had ended countless boardroom discussions. I will not have this company associated with your personal social experiments, and I certainly won't hire some unqualified individual just because you've developed a misguided attraction to him. He's not unqualified. He has an MBA from UW, relevant experience, and a proven track record. Madison, enough. Richard stood up, his full authority as CEO and father bearing down on her. You are making a fool of yourself and embarrassing this family. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this stops now. You will not bring up this man again. You will not pursue whatever relationship you think you're building with him, and you will certainly not recommend him for any position within this company. And if I refuse? Richard's expression became very cold. Then you'll need to decide what's more important to you, your career, your family, and your future, or this phase you're going through. Madison left her father's office feeling like she'd been physically struck. But underneath the hurt and anger, she felt something else growing, a determination she'd never experienced before. For 26 years, she'd based her identity on her family's approval and her place in their social hierarchy. But for the first time, she was beginning to understand that maintaining that identity might require her to ignore injustices she could no longer pretend not to see. That evening, she found herself back at Victrola Coffee, hoping Marcus might be there. He wasn't, but she ordered a drink anyway and sat in the corner where they'd talked, thinking about Jennifer's son Miguel staying with his grandmother, about Elena's tears of gratitude, about Marcus's patient explanations of realities she'd never considered. Her phone buzzed with texts from her mother, her brother, and 3 family friends, all expressing concern about reports that she'd been acting strangely and asking if she needed to talk. The speed of the gossip network reminded her that in her world, even private conversations with her father became public knowledge within hours. As she sat in the diverse, vibrant space that had once felt foreign and now felt like the most honest place she knew, Madison realized she was facing the first real choice of her adult life. She could return to the comfortable certainty of her inherited worldview, accept her family's definition of success and responsibility, and continue living the life that had been planned for her since birth. Or she could step into the unknown territory of questioning everything she'd been taught, risk her family's disapproval and her social standing, and try to become the kind of person who showed up when someone needed help, regardless of whether that someone looked like her or came from her world. The decision should have been terrifying. Instead, for the first time in weeks, Madison felt something that might have been peace. Madison's transformation accelerated rapidly after her confrontation with her father. The next morning, she walked into Jennifer's workspace with a proposal that would have shocked her previous self. Jennifer, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What would it actually take, in terms of salary, benefits, or support, for you to live comfortably in this city while raising your son? Jennifer looked around nervously, clearly worried about discussing money with the boss's daughter. Miss Sinclair, I appreciate your concern, but I don't want to cause any problems. You won't cause problems. I promise. I'm trying to understand something important, and your perspective could help not just you, but other employees too. After some gentle encouragement, Jennifer opened up about the reality of her financial situation. Childcare costs, medical expenses, transportation, housing. Madison took notes on everything, building a comprehensive picture of what working-class survival actually looked like in their expensive city. The hardest part, Jennifer confided, is that I want to do better for Miguel. I'd love to take some night classes, maybe work toward a degree, but I can't afford babysitting and tuition at the same time. So, I'm stuck in this cycle where I can't improve our situation because I'm too busy just surviving it. That afternoon, Madison did something unprecedented. She used her own money to hire Marcus as a consultant, not for Sinclair Technologies, but for herself. She wanted to understand exactly how his supply chain optimization worked and whether it could create the kind of savings that would allow companies to invest more in their employees. They met at his small office in a converted warehouse in Georgetown, a part of Seattle she'd never visited before. The space was modest but professional, with charts and projections covering the walls and a sophisticated computer setup that clearly represented a significant investment for someone building a business from the ground up. I want to understand your process, Madison told him. If I were to recommend your services to other companies, not Sinclair Technologies, but other businesses in the city, I need to know exactly what you offer and how it works. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What happened to keeping our worlds separate? My world is smaller than I thought it was, and less fair than I was willing to admit. Over the next 3 hours, Marcus walked her through case studies of businesses he'd helped, showing her detailed analyses of inefficient systems and the elegant solutions he'd developed. Madison found herself genuinely impressed by his expertise, not surprised that a black man could be intelligent, which would have been condescending, but impressed by the sophisticated thinking and innovative approaches he brought to complex problems. This is brilliant work, Marcus. Why aren't you drowning in clients? Because most business owners hire consultants through networks I'm not part of. They get recommendations from golf partners, country club members, college fraternity brothers. Even when they're genuinely open to working with someone like me, I'm usually not on their radar because we don't move in the same circles. What if someone helped you access those circles? Someone who did have those connections? Marcus studied her face carefully. Madison, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that I help you build your client base by making introductions and vouching for your work. In exchange, you help me understand how to create more equitable business practices that actually work financially. That's a pretty big shift from where you were a month ago. Madison thought about Jennifer's son, Miguel, about Elena's desperation, about her father's cold dismissal of employee struggles. A month ago, I thought the system was fair because it was fair to me. Now, I'm starting to understand that my experience isn't everyone's experience. They spent the evening developing a plan. Madison would use her social connections to arrange introductions for Marcus with potential clients, while he would help her develop a framework for ethical business practices that could serve as a model for other companies. It wasn't charity or activism. It was a genuine business partnership that leveraged their different strengths and networks. There's one thing I need you to understand, Marcus said as they finalized their agreement. If you do this, if you start publicly advocating for these kinds of changes and associating with me professionally, there will be consequences in your social circle. Some people will accept it, but others won't. Are you prepared for that? Madison thought about her family's expectations, her mother's warnings, her father's ultimatum. I'm tired of living in a world that only works for people who look like me and come from where I come from. If changing that cost me some relationships, maybe those weren't relationships worth keeping. As they shook hands on their partnership, Madison felt something she'd never experienced before. The satisfaction of making a decision based on her own values rather than her family's expectations. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. That night, she called Emma, who was still finishing her residency in Baltimore. I need to tell you about some changes I'm making." "Changes like what?" Madison explained her new partnership. With Marcus, her growing understanding of systemic inequality, and her decision to use her privilege to advocate for more equitable business practices. "Madison, are you sure about this? You know Mom and Dad are going to lose their minds." "I'm sure. For the first time in my life, I'm making decisions based on what I think is right rather than what's expected of me. It feels scary, but also honest." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "You know what? I'm proud of you. I've been watching you your whole life trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect employee, the perfect member of our social circle. But I've never seen you try to be yourself before." "I'm not even sure who that is yet." "Then I guess you're about to find out." Hello, the Shade of Love family. So happy you're here. Before we jump into the next part of the story, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your country and state in the comments. Also, how's the story been so far? We love reading your thoughts. Yes, every single comment. And it really keeps us motivated. Let's aim for 50 comments on this video. Think we can hit it? Your support means the world, so don't forget to comment, share, and keep the energy flowing. The moment of truth came sooner than Madison expected, at the Pacific Northwest Business Leaders Summit, an annual gathering of Seattle's most influential entrepreneurs and executives. Madison had attended every year since joining Sinclair Technologies, usually as her father's representative at panels about young professionals and innovation. This year, she was scheduled to speak on a panel about corporate social responsibility in the modern era. She'd spent weeks preparing remarks that would have satisfied her family's expectations while subtly introducing ideas about employee welfare and community investment. Safe, conventional talking points that wouldn't ruffle feathers or challenge the status quo. But as she sat backstage listening to the previous panel discuss talent acquisition challenges, she heard the same coded language, the same assumptions, the same blind spots that had shaped her own thinking for so many years. "The problem is that qualified candidates don't seem to want to work hard anymore," one panelist was saying. "They expect everything handed to them instead of paying their dues like we did." Madison thought about Jennifer working full-time while barely able to afford childcare, about Marcus driving Uber at night to fund his consulting business, about Elena cleaning office buildings while worrying about her daughter's medical bills. She thought about all the hard work she'd witnessed that went unrecognized because it didn't happen in boardrooms or country clubs. When her panel was called, Madison walked onto the stage with a speech she'd rewritten entirely that morning. The moderator, Patricia Wellington, her mother's friend from the charity circuit, introduced her with glowing praise for the Sinclair family's contributions to Seattle's business community. "Madison, let's start with you. What does corporate social responsibility look like for the next generation of business leaders?" Madison took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "Thank you, Patricia. I think corporate social responsibility for my generation has to start with honest recognition that the playing field isn't as level as we've been taught to believe." A subtle shift in the audience's attention told her she'd already veered off script. 6 months ago, I would have given you a very different answer. I would have talked about charitable giving, volunteer programs, maybe some environmental initiatives. All good things, but all ways of addressing symptoms rather than causes. She could see her father in the audience, his expression growing more concerned by the second. "But I've learned recently that true corporate social responsibility means examining our own practices, not just our charitable donations. It means asking hard questions about whether our hiring practices actually identify the best candidates, or just the candidates who remind us of ourselves. It means considering whether our compensation structures allow hard-working employees to build stable lives, or whether we're expecting people to work full-time jobs that still leave them one. Medical emergency away from financial disaster." The audience was now completely silent, a mixture of confusion and discomfort rippling through the room. "I want to tell you about Jennifer Rodriguez, who works for my family's company. Jennifer is smart, reliable, and dedicated. She's also a single mother who was recently injured in a car accident. Despite working full-time and having health insurance, she couldn't afford to keep her son with her during her recovery because the medical bills and lost wages from her time off work pushed her past the financial breaking point. Madison saw her father stand up abruptly and start moving toward the exit, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Jennifer's situation isn't unusual. It's the reality for millions of working Americans who are doing everything right, but still struggling because wages haven't kept pace with the cost of living, because our healthcare system creates financial catastrophe from medical emergencies, and because our business practices prioritize shareholder returns over employee welfare. The moderator tried to interrupt, but Madison pressed on. I also want to tell you about Marcus Thompson, who has an MBA and runs a successful consulting business that helps companies reduce costs while improving efficiency. Marcus is brilliant, innovative, and exactly the kind of entrepreneur we claim to value. But he's had to build his business from the ground up because traditional networks didn't give him the same access to opportunities that people who look like me have always taken for granted. She could see people in the audience checking their phones, probably texting about the Sinclair daughter's public breakdown. Board members from her father's company were whispering urgently among themselves. These aren't abstract policy issues. They're the lived experiences of people in our community, people who work for our companies, people who deserve the same opportunities for success that many of us inherited simply by being born into the right families. Madison paused, looking out at the sea of uncomfortable faces. Real corporate social responsibility means using our privilege and our platforms to create more equitable systems, not just to write checks to charity galas. It means recognizing that diversity isn't about political correctness. It's about accessing the full range of talent and perspectives that make businesses stronger. It means paying wages that allow people to build stable lives, providing benefits that actually protect employees from financial catastrophe, and opening our networks to qualified people regardless of their background or connections. The moderator finally found her voice. Madison, these are certainly interesting perspectives, but don't you think individual responsibility plays a role in people's economic outcomes? Absolutely. But individual responsibility can only operate within the systems we create collectively. If those systems are fundamentally unfair, then individual effort can only go so far. Our responsibility as business leaders is to create systems that reward merit, hard work, and innovation, regardless of where those qualities come from. As Madison concluded her remarks and left the stage, she felt simultaneously terrified and liberated. She'd just publicly challenged everything her family's social and business circles believed about success, merit, and social responsibility. She'd used specific examples that made her abstract points painfully concrete, and she'd done it in front of an audience that included her father's business partners, her mother's friends, and her own professional network. Her phone was already buzzing with texts and calls, but she ignored them all. She had one more stop to make before facing the inevitable confrontation with her family. She drove straight to Jennifer's neighborhood and knocked on her door. "Miss Sinclair? What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" "Jennifer, I need to ask you something important. If I offered you a job at a different company, one that pays enough for you to support Miguel comfortably and provides the kind of benefits that would actually protect you from financial emergencies, would you be interested?" Jennifer stared at her. "What kind of job?" "Administrative manager for a growing consulting business. Someone who can handle client relations, project coordination, and office management. Someone smart, reliable, and dedicated, like you." "Miss Sinclair, I don't understand. Why would you do this?" Madison smiled, feeling more certain of herself than she had in months. "Because everyone deserves the chance to build a stable life through their hard work, and because I'm finally learning the difference between charity and justice.